Aman was always the quiet one. The one who would sit in the back of the class, head down, eyes fixed on his phone, lost in his own world. No one ever really paid much attention to him, until that one night, when everything changed. It was a stormy evening, and the kind of rain that makes everything feel darker, more mysterious. The city streets were slick, reflections of neon lights dancing on puddles, and the sound of thunder seemed to echo through the narrow alleyways. But in the midst of the storm, Aman found himself standing outside a forgotten, abandoned house at the edge of town, a place most people avoided, their whispers laced with stories of its cursed past. For as long as he could remember, Aman had heard the rumors. They said the house was haunted, that strange noises filled the halls at night, and some even claimed they saw shadows moving behind the broken windows. But for Aman, it was just another myth. Until tonight. His fingers trembled as he pushed open the creaky gate, the hinges screeching like a warning. He didn't know why he had come here. Maybe it was the dare from his friends earlier that evening, or maybe it was the undeniable pull of something darker. He didn't believe in ghosts, but as he stepped onto the overgrown lawn, a chill ran down his spine, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Inside, the house was exactly how he imagined, dust-covered furniture, peeling wallpaper, and a suffocating silence that felt almost alive. But as he wandered through the hallway, his flashlight beam flickering across old family portraits that seemed to watch his every move, something didn't sit right. There was a door at the far end of the hallway, one that wasn't on any floor plan of the house he'd seen. It was old, rusted, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. But in that moment, it called to him. Aman hesitated. What could possibly be behind it? Curiosity gnawed at him, but fear kept him rooted to the spot. But then, there was a sound. A soft scraping, like something, or someone, was trying to open it from the other side. His breath hitched, and the hair on his neck stood up. Was he really hearing that? He wasn't sure, but the air around him suddenly felt colder. He wasn't alone. He moved forward, almost against his will, and reached for the doorknob. The moment his hand touched it, the door creaked open with an eerie slowness, revealing nothing but pitch darkness. No light, no sounds, just an overwhelming emptiness that swallowed him whole. But as he took a step inside, his foot hit something. A cold, metallic object. And that's when he saw it. A symbol, scrawled on the floor, faint but unmistakable. It was like nothing he had ever seen before, a symbol of warning, of something ancient and forgotten. Aman stepped back in shock. Was it just his imagination, or had he just crossed a line he couldn't return from? Before he could even process what was happening, the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him in the darkness. And then, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. What was waiting for Aman on the other side of that door? Was it just a ghost story, or something far worse? Stay tuned for the next part of his terrifying journey. Aman's heart pounded in his chest as the footsteps behind him grew louder, closer. He spun around, his flashlight flickering weakly, casting long shadows across the room. There was nothing. No one. Just the overwhelming darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. His breath came in ragged gasps as he strained his ears, hoping to hear something, anything, that could explain the eerie sounds. But the silence returned, thick and suffocating. He took a step back, but his foot caught on something, sending him stumbling forward. He barely managed to catch himself against the wall. His pulse raced. He had to get out. This place, it was wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew heavier with each passing second. A cold sweat dripped down his forehead as he tried the doorknob again, but it didn't budge. The door was locked. Panic started to rise in his chest. Amon's mind raced. What had he gotten himself into? He could hear his friends' voices echoing in his head, laughing as they dared him to enter the house. They didn't believe in the stories, just like him. They thought it was all a joke. But standing here now, in the thick of it, it didn't feel like a joke anymore. The stories, he had heard them all his life. The tales about the house at the end of the street, whispered behind closed doors. It was said to have once belonged to an eccentric old man who had vanished without a trace, leaving everything behind. No one knew where he went, or if he had even left at all. But some claimed they saw him, standing at the windows, watching. The house, abandoned for years, became the subject of local legends. Some said it was cursed, that the man had dabbled in things better left alone. And there were rumors about the symbol. No one knew what it meant, but they all agreed it wasn't something you should mess with. Aman had always dismissed the stories, chalking them up to nothing more than small-town superstition. But now, as the air seemed to thicken and the footsteps behind him grew more distinct, he couldn't help but wonder if there was more truth to them than he'd ever realized. His flashlight flickered again, casting a momentary glow on the floor. That was when he noticed it. A faint outline beneath the dust, as if something had been moved recently. His eyes narrowed, and he dropped to his knees, brushing away the dust and debris. There, etched into the wooden floorboards, was another symbol, identical to the one he'd seen earlier. It was almost like a pattern, like a map, and it didn't belong. The sudden realization hit him like a wave. Someone had been here recently. But who? And why had they left this behind? He ran his fingers along the symbol, feeling a strange heat radiating from it. A feeling he couldn't explain, like the symbol was alive. A creaking noise echoed from somewhere deeper inside the house. Aman froze, his breath catching in his throat. The footsteps, the scraping sound, they were coming closer again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone, or something, was moving through the house. Aman scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. He couldn't stay here. He needed to find another way out. But as he turned to move, something caught his eye, something in the corner of the room. A shadow, long and thin, moving against the far wall. It didn't belong. His stomach turned as he realized it wasn't just a shadow. It was a figure. A person. No, it couldn't be. No one was supposed to be here. Before he could take a step toward the figure, a loud bang echoed from the floor above. The sound was so forceful that it made the whole house shudder. And then, silence. The kind of silence that made his skin crawl. Aman's instincts screamed at him to run. But his feet felt frozen, his body paralyzed with fear. He could hear the footsteps now. Closer, heavier, deliberate. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't his imagination. Someone, or something, was coming for him. The door that had once been locked now seemed almost like an escape, but the mystery of what lay beyond the dark threshold kept him rooted to the spot. Who else was in this house? What did they want from him? He had to know. But as the footsteps drew closer, he realized that getting the answers might come at a cost far greater than he was willing to pay. Aman turned back toward the room, his eyes locking on the strange symbol beneath his feet. What if it was a clue? What if it was the key to getting out? But before he could act, a low, guttural voice filled the room, sending a chill through his bones. "I knew you would come." Amon's heart stopped for a moment when he heard the voice. It was low, raspy, almost like it came from somewhere deep within the walls of the house. It wasn't a voice that belonged to any living person. The hairs on his neck stood on end as he slowly turned around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The room was empty. At least, it seemed that way at first. His flashlight barely illuminated the far corners, where shadows clung to the walls like dark secrets. But that voice, it wasn't a figment of his imagination. He was sure of it now. "I knew you would come," the voice repeated, this time louder, clearer, as if it was standing right next to him. Aman's breath hitched. He spun around, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, someone who might have snuck in behind him. But there was nothing. Just the heavy silence of the room, the air thick with something unnatural. His mind raced. Who was that? Could it have been someone who lived here? But the house had been abandoned for years. The neighbors never spoke of anyone coming or going. The only person who had ever lived here was the old man, who had disappeared, leaving no trace. Aman stepped back, his feet crunching against the floorboards. His eyes darted toward the far side of the room, where the strange symbol on the floor seemed to pulse with an eerie glow. It almost looked like it was moving, the lines of the drawing shifting ever so slightly, as if alive. He knelt down, his hand instinctively reaching out to touch it. As his fingers brushed against the symbol, a jolt of electricity shot through him. His body stiffened, and for a moment he could see flashes, images flashing in front of his eyes. Strange landscapes, a dark figure, a cold, endless void. And in the middle of it all, he saw himself, standing in that very room, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "Stop," he whispered, pulling his hand back. The flashes stopped immediately, but the room seemed to close in on him. It felt as if the house itself was alive, breathing, watching, waiting. The footsteps returned, this time from the floor above. They were slow, deliberate, each one echoing in the silence like a countdown. Aman's chest tightened as he realized that whatever was here, whatever force had been lurking in the shadows, was not a ghost. It wasn't a curse, either. It was something much older, much darker, something tied to the very heart of the house. He stood up, his thoughts racing. He needed answers, but the more he uncovered, the more dangerous this place seemed. His mind went back to the stories, the ones he had dismissed for years. The cursed symbol, the old man, the whispers in the wind. But none of it had prepared him for what was unfolding right before his eyes. A loud bang came from the floor above, followed by a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the wooden floor. The noise was so intense that it made the walls shake. Aman jumped, his heartbeat thumping in his ears. There was no time to waste. He had to get out of here, but the door remained locked, and the only other way out was the staircase leading up to the second floor, where the noise was coming from. With a deep breath, he forced himself to move, his legs heavy with fear. He didn't know why he was doing this, why he was still looking for answers, but some part of him felt a pull, a need to understand what had brought him here, why this house was calling to him. He climbed the staircase slowly, each step creaking under his weight, the air growing colder with every inch he ascended. The dragging sound was louder now, closer, as though whatever was making it was just a few feet away. His flashlight flickered again, casting erratic shadows on the walls. For a brief second, he thought he saw something standing at the top of the stairs, something tall and dark, its outline barely visible in the dim light. But when he blinked, it was gone. Aman hesitated. Was it real? His pulse raced, but he had no choice. He had come this far, and he couldn't turn back now. As he reached the top of the stairs, he stepped into a narrow hallway. The door at the end was cracked open, and a thin, sickly light spilled out into the hallway. The dragging sound grew louder, and for a moment, Aman thought he could hear something muttering, a low, guttural sound, like someone whispering to themselves, but the words were indistinguishable. He reached the door and pushed it open. What he saw on the other side made his blood run cold. The room was small, cluttered with old furniture covered in tattered sheets, but in the center there was a large wooden chest. It was covered in dust, its edges worn from age, but there was something about it, something familiar. The dragging noise had stopped, and in the silence, Aman's eyes locked onto something in the chest. A figure, a body. It was unmistakable, its hands bound to the sides of the chest, its head slumped forward, and as Aman stepped closer, his flashlight illuminated the face. It was his own. Aman froze, his breath catching in his throat. He stood at the edge of the room, the beam of his flashlight trembling in his hand as it flickered over the face of the body in the chest. It was him. His own face, pale and lifeless, eyes wide open in an expression of sheer terror. His heart hammered in his chest, threatening to burst out of his ribs. This can't be real, he thought, his mind struggling to make sense of the scene before him. His eyes were locked on the body, but it felt as though his entire body had turned to stone. His legs refused to move, his feet glued to the floor. He couldn't look away, even as every instinct in him screamed to run, to get out of the house, to never think about this again. But there was something about the sight of his own face, something that made it impossible to turn around. A chill crept up his spine, spreading from the pit of his stomach as a strange, dark whisper filled the room. It wasn't in his ears, but inside his head, like the walls were closing in on his mind. Asterisk, I told you. I knew you would come. Asterisk, the voice sounded familiar, but distorted, like it was a reflection of something he had heard before. It was coming from the chest, from the body. But how? Aman shook his head, forcing himself to breathe. He stepped closer, his legs trembling under him. The flashlight beam danced wildly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. He could feel the heat of the room rising, thickening the air until it was nearly suffocating. His palms were slick with sweat, his fingers gripping the flashlight so tightly that it hurt. He had to understand what was happening. What was this place? Why was his body here, trapped in this chest? Was this a warning? Suddenly, the body twitched. Just a slight movement, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to send a jolt of panic through Aman's veins. He stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from his grasp and hitting the floor with a loud crash. Darkness consumed the room, leaving only the faint outline of the chest visible. His pulse quickened as he fumbled in the dark, reaching for the flashlight. His breathing grew shallow, every sound around him magnified, the soft rustling of fabric, the creaking of floorboards, the distant thunder outside. Then, the whisper again. Louder this time, more urgent. Asterisk, you're too late. The door is already open. Asterisk. Aman's heart skipped a beat. He turned, his eyes scanning the shadows, but saw nothing. He couldn't tell if the voice was in his head or if it was coming from the house itself, but either way, it felt like it was everywhere. The walls seemed to shift, the air warping, bending around him. His thoughts were unraveling. The door. The voice had mentioned a door. What door? He turned back to the chest, his mind racing. The body inside, his body, wasn't still anymore. It was moving. Slowly, the arms raised, twitching and jerking, as though some invisible force was controlling it. He could hear the creaking of the wood as the body strained against its restraints. And then, without warning, the eyes snapped open. Not the empty, lifeless stare he had seen before. No, this time, they were filled with something else. With recognition. With awareness. The figure in the chest started to sit up, the movement jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. Aman's chest tightened as he backed away, his head spinning. His own face, his own body, sitting up, staring at him with a look of cold intensity. It was impossible. His mind couldn't make sense of it. Run, run, run. But his feet remained rooted to the spot. The body stood now, and despite every instinct telling him to flee, he couldn't. The figure, his doppelganger, took a step forward, dragging its feet across the wooden floor. The air in the room grew heavier, suffocating, and every sound seemed amplified, echoing in his ears. The chest was wide open now, and as Aman looked closer, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Inside the chest, there was a symbol carved into the wood, a symbol that matched the one on the floor below. The same strange, shifting design, the same eerie energy. It felt like the house itself was alive, a vessel for something far older, far darker than anything he could have imagined. The figure reached out toward him, its hand trembling but determined, and the whisper came again, louder now, almost deafening. It's too late. You're already part of it, Aman's breath caught in his throat as the figure's fingers brushed against his own. A surge of energy shot through him, sharp and cold, like being struck by lightning. He felt the weight of the house pressing in on him, the walls closing in, the air growing thick. His vision blurred, and for a moment he was no longer standing in the room. He was somewhere else, somewhere far darker, more twisted. The cold void from his flash of vision earlier. He could feel the weight of something ancient, something pulling him toward it, consuming him from the inside out. But just as suddenly as the feeling came, it vanished. Aman gasped for air, blinking as his vision cleared. He was back in the room. The figure was standing in front of him, inches away, staring into his eyes. And in that moment, he knew. The house had never been abandoned. It had never been empty. It was a prison for whoever came too close to its secrets. And now, it had him. The footsteps upstairs began again, louder this time, as if something, or someone, was coming down to join them. And Aman realized, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that the real nightmare was only just beginning. Aman's mind raced, his body frozen in place, as the figure in front of him stepped closer, its movements eerily deliberate. The air felt thick, every breath a struggle against the suffocating pressure. He could hear the footsteps from above again, closer this time, echoing down the staircase like a countdown to something inevitable. What is happening? His pulse thundered in his ears as he took a step back, but the figure, his own face, twisted and distorted, moved with him, shadowing his every move. The whisper returned, louder now, like 1,000 voices layered on top of each other, vibrating in his skull. You think you're the first? The words weren't spoken, they were felt. A deep, gnawing sensation that sank into his bones. You're not the first. You won't be the last. The room seemed to pulse, the walls bending in on him as if the house itself was alive, feeding off his fear. Aman's heart slammed against his ribs as his mind tried to piece together what was happening. The symbol, the chest, the body, everything he thought he understood was collapsing into something worse, something he wasn't ready for. He couldn't think clearly, couldn't even focus as his breath quickened and the oppressive feeling in the room grew heavier. Then, just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sudden noise made him jump, spinning around to face the closed doorway, his heartbeat skipping. He hadn't heard anyone enter. His pulse raced as he reached for the door handle, but it was locked. It was like the house was trapping him, keeping him inside. The figure before him let out a low, guttural laugh, the sound like nails scraping against metal. Aman's eyes darted between the body and the door, his mind working frantically. But just as he opened his mouth to scream, the floor beneath him trembled. The entire house seemed to shift, groaning as though it were waking up, stretching its limbs in the dark. The walls cracked and popped, and the room around him began to distort, the edges warping like a bad reflection in water. Amon's breath hitched as a second wave of dread washed over him. The footsteps from above weren't just one set anymore. There were multiple sets. 1, 2, 3, each one thundering down the stairs toward him. Each step seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Aman tried to move, to run, but his legs refused to obey. His body felt heavy, weighed down by something invisible, something that was holding him in place. He could feel it now, the oppressive weight of whatever force had taken root in the house. The figure moved again, its eyes never leaving him, as though it was studying him, waiting for him to understand something he hadn't yet realized. Then, the door on the far side of the room, a door that hadn't been there before, creaked open. The space behind it was black, pitch dark, and from within that darkness, a voice called to him. "Come closer, Aman," it whispered, the tone almost familiar. "Come closer if you want to understand." It was the voice of the old man, the one who had vanished years ago, the one whose story had been told 1,000 times in hushed whispers around town, the man who had disappeared, leaving nothing but a curse behind. Amon's stomach twisted, and every fibre of his being screamed at him to turn and run. But he was drawn to the voice. Something inside him, a need to know, to understand, kept him rooted to the spot. The figure in front of him seemed to melt into the shadows, its form blurring and flickering like an image on a broken screen, as though it were fading, becoming something else. Before he could react, the floor beneath him cracked open, and the entire house seemed to groan. A sudden, unbearable heat filled the room, and a blast of wind surged from the darkened doorway, pulling at his clothes, at his skin. The air was thick with the scent of something rotten, of decay and dust and time. Aman took a step forward, barely aware of what he was doing. His feet felt numb as he moved toward the open door, the shadows beyond it pulling him in like a whirlpool. The footsteps from above were deafening now, a cacophony of heavy, dragging steps. There was no escape, no way out. He stepped through the threshold, his hands trembling as he reached for the wall to steady himself. The darkness was almost tangible here. He could feel it pressing against his skin, against his mind, as though something, someone was watching him, waiting. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind him. Aman spun around, but it was too late. The darkness had already consumed him, wrapping around his body, swallowing him whole. And in that moment, he understood. He understood why he was here, why he was trapped in this nightmare. He wasn't the first. He wouldn't be the last. This house, this cursed, twisted place, wasn't just a prison. It was a doorway, a gateway, and he had just crossed the threshold. The door slammed shut behind Aman with a violent crash, plunging him into an abyss of darkness. His breath came in shallow gasps, his heart hammering in his chest, the weight of the air pressing against his lungs. He reached out instinctively, his hand brushing against the cold, damp stone walls. The room was unlike anything he had seen before, a small, circular chamber, the walls covered in strange symbols, ancient and unfamiliar, etched deep into the stone like they had been there for centuries. The temperature had dropped drastically, and he could feel his skin prickling as if the darkness itself was alive, breathing, watching. Then the voice came again, softer this time, but far more unsettling. You were always meant to find it, Aman. You were always meant to come, It was the same voice he had heard earlier, the one that had echoed through the house, the one that seemed to speak not in words but in thoughts. But this time, it didn't feel like it was coming from the walls. It felt as if it was coming from within him, from the deepest part of his soul. Aman's thoughts raced, struggling to comprehend what was happening. This was it. This is why he was here. He had thought the house was a trap, a place meant to imprison those who dared to enter. But no, he was part of it, part of the story, part of something far older and far darker than he could have ever imagined. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow now, faint, but undeniable. They pulsed with a rhythm, as if alive, alive in the same way the house itself seemed to breathe. He couldn't explain it, but he knew one thing. He had to get out of here. He had to find a way to break free from whatever hold this place had on him. Aman stumbled back, his body slick with sweat, his mind unraveling as he turned to face the far corner of the room. That's when he saw it. The chest. It was a dark, wooden chest, similar to the one he had seen earlier, the one with his body inside. But now it was open, and inside was nothing but empty air, an abyss of blackness that seemed to go on forever. Aman's breath caught in his throat as he stepped forward, his feet dragging, unwillingly drawn to the chest. The air around it was thick, oppressive, and the pull was almost magnetic. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling, and as soon as his fingertips brushed the edge of the chest, a rush of memories flooded his mind. This wasn't the first time he had been here. Images, flashing quickly, memories that weren't his own. He saw himself standing in this very room years ago, a different version of himself, older, eyes filled with desperation. He saw the same chest, the same symbols, the same doorway. But this time, something was different. This time, he wasn't trying to escape. He was choosing to stay. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The truth was inescapable. This wasn't a house that trapped people. It was a house that called them. It didn't force them inside. It didn't lock them in. It simply waited for the right person to come along, someone like Aman, someone who had always been meant to find it, to join it. Aman staggered back, his legs giving way as the full weight of the truth crashed down on him. The house wasn't just a cursed place. It was a cycle, a ritual, a never-ending loop of souls bound together by an ancient power. He was part of it now, whether he liked it or not. He was destined to become like the others, like the old man, like the many before him, trapped in the darkness, never to leave. But just as the weight of that realization began to crush him, a sharp, sudden sound cut through the silence, the sound of the door behind him creaking open. The air seemed to shift, light filtering through from the other side, soft and warm, like the dawn breaking after a long, endless night. Aman turned, confused, disoriented. The door was wide open now, revealing a passage back into the house that had swallowed him whole just moments ago. For a brief, fleeting moment, he thought about running, about escaping. But the figure with his own face, stepped into the doorway, its eyes gleaming with an unsettling knowledge. "You can't leave," the figure said, its voice calm, almost serene. "You never could." Aman's breath caught in his throat as the figure took a step forward. The symbols on the walls flickered, their light intensifying as if they were reacting to the figure's presence. And then, something even stranger happened. The figure's face twisted, morphing into something else, something more terrifying, more ancient. Its eyes deepened, darkened, until they were nothing but endless pits of shadow. "You are the house," the figure whispered, its voice no longer human, no longer familiar. "And you always have been." Aman's knees buckled, and for a moment he thought he might collapse, but the figure was already there, its hand gripping his shoulder, pulling him forward. The darkness behind the door began to pull at him, tugging at his soul as if it had a mind of its own. His body screamed to escape, but the truth was undeniable. There was no escape. The door that had opened wasn't freedom. It was a part of the cycle, a new chapter, and the house had claimed him at last. As his vision darkened, the last thing Aman saw before he was swallowed by the shadows was the face of the figure. his own face, smiling. And then, everything went black. The door to the house slammed shut, and all was silent. But deep within the darkness, in the deepest corners of the house, a new symbol began to glow, faint but unmistakable. It was the same as before, but with one difference. This time, it had his name etched into it. The house was silent once more. The air, thick and heavy, seemed to settle like dust, lingering in the corners where light never reached. The door that had once stood open was now shut tight, sealing Aman's fate within its cold stone walls. Yet, in that eerie stillness, something had changed. Outside, the storm raged on, its thunder crashing against the night sky as if the heavens themselves mourned what had just unfolded within those cursed walls. But inside the house, time felt like it had frozen, like it had become part of the house's eternal cycle, a loop that stretched on, unbroken. Aman's face, now permanently etched into the house's dark legacy, stared back at him from every corner. The walls seemed to breathe with his presence, the symbols that had once seemed foreign now belonging to him, as much a part of his soul as the pulse in his veins. The house had claimed him, not with force, but with inevitability. It had waited for him, drawn him in, and in the end he had come, just like all the others before him. The door, once a symbol of hope, of escape, had closed behind him, but Aman knew now that it had never really offered freedom. The house didn't trap its victims. It absorbed them. Every person who had ever walked through its doors had left their mark, had become part of the house's endless cycle. Their stories, their fears, their faces, now woven into the very fabric of this place. As Aman wandered through the halls, he could feel the presence of those who had come before him. The old man, the ones who had whispered of curses, the ones who had vanished without a trace. They were all there, their souls bound to the house just as his would be now. He could feel them in the shadows, in the air, in the walls. But there was no time for fear now. He had become something else, something different. He understood now, as the house had always known, that there was no escape, only a transformation. He wasn't trapped in the house. He had become the house itself. The whispers that had once filled his mind, the voices that had guided him here, they were part of him now. The symbols on the walls, the strange symbols that had seemed so menacing, now felt familiar, like fragments of his own memories, pieces of a puzzle that had finally clicked into place. He could hear the murmur of the house, feel it stirring, as if the very heart of the structure was beating in time with his own. He had been brought here for a reason, not to die, not to escape, but to join. And as Aman stood in the center of that darkened room, surrounded by the symbols, he finally understood the truth. The house had never needed to trap him. It needed him to choose it, to willingly accept the fate that had been waiting for him all along. The cycle would continue. The door would open again, for someone else. Someone who, like him, would find their way to this cursed place. And when they did, the house would be ready. It always was. Somewhere deep within the walls, the faint glow of the symbol with his name still flickered. It would remain there, a reminder of the twisted, eternal pact made in the darkness, a pact that could never be undone. And the house would wait, just as it always had.